If you're a home coffee roaster and you've got a bag of green coffee at home with some tasting notes on it, and you want to figure out how to roast that coffee to experience and taste those flavor notes, then stick around. All right, thank you for joining me today and welcome to the Virtual Coffee Lab. So you've bought some green coffee, you've got a label on the bag, and you want to roast your coffee to achieve those tasting notes. After all, that's why you bought the coffee. You read the tasting notes and you said, that sounds good, I want that coffee. And now you're ready to roast it. But how do we achieve that? What is a way that we can achieve those flavor notes or tasting notes? Well, the short answer is that the magic happens, a lot of it happens during this middle phase of roasting called the browning phase. And we want to talk about that today, but I want to talk about first what's happening during that phase, and then I want to talk about how we can achieve that or how we can attain those notes. So first, what's happening during that middle phase, that browning phase? When we apply heat to coffee, we're heating the beans up, and they get to the point where they get from green to yellow, and that's where this beginning part of this middle phase takes place. So we go through the dry phase, the beans turn from green to yellow, we hit dry end, and the beans are yellow. Now we enter the browning stage or the browning phase. From yellow to first crack is what we call the browning phase. The coffee is going to turn from yellow to brown, and there's going to be all kinds of molecular changes, chemical reactions that are taking place inside the coffee bean. The first one that takes place, or one of the ones that takes place, is caramelization. So coffee has natural sugars inside of the coffee, complex carbohydrates, and when heat is applied, the molecular structure changes and these chemical reactions take place, and we start to have sweetness developed. And that is called caramelization. Caramelization, if we can talk about this for a second, imagine using, let's say you want to throw some roasted vegetables in the oven, put them on a pan or a flat tray, and you roast them in the oven. And so things like carrots, broccoli, cauliflower, these things have natural sugars in them, and when we apply heat to those vegetables, they become sweeter. That's the caramelization process. The same thing happens with coffee beans. We're applying heat over time, and caramelization takes place. The other reaction takes place with amino acids that are also found in coffee beans. And amino acids are what give us the acidity in a lot of these tasting notes, the fruitiness that we seek out in the tasting notes. And so using temperature with heat applied and then time, this middle phase that we're roasting in, we're allowing these chemical reactions for both caramelization and the acidity to take place while the beans are going through this roasting process. So that's what's happening to the beans during this middle phase. The question is, how do we accomplish getting these flavors? Common things, common problems that happen are when we roast this coffee, we get, if we rush through this middle phase, this browning phase, let's just say that we fly through the phase because we had our burner or our energy on 100%, we got the beans to turn yellow, and we start to back off on the heat, but the roast is just flying, and we go through this middle phase so quickly that the coffee becomes almost bitter or extremely tart. Or, as a matter of fact, we don't allow the chemical reactions to take place long enough for the sweetness, the caramelization to take place, or the acidity to be formed. So we get this distorted flavor, and it doesn't taste good. The beans probably aren't even roasted all the way through, and so it's just not really a good experience. And there's different variations of that all the way up to the perfect point wherever that is in your tasting experience of what you're trying to achieve. The opposite effect is that if you draw out this phase too long, then you end up turning your sweetness into a bitterness, and you lose all of the acidity. It becomes very kind of a flat, or and some people would call it a baked coffee.
There is no flavor. There are no spices. Where are the chips?
And so we want to be very careful not to be too short or too long in this phase. This is where there's going to have to be some experimenting, and we'll talk about how to do that in just a minute. But ultimately, it's important for us to understand the three phases of coffee, the amount of percentage of time devoted in each phase of the roast, what each phase and its purpose is for, and ultimately we set ourselves up for success for this middle phase. So we want to avoid roasting defects during the dry phase. We don't want to rush through the dry phase so fast that we come into this point where the beans turn color too quickly, because the inside of the bean is still not roasted completely yet either. And we just want this to be timed right so that the bean is roasted evenly throughout the process. It takes a while for the heat to penetrate to the center of the bean, and so these chemical reactions are going to be taking place all through this process as they start to go further and further into the bean center. So we have the dry phase, we set ourselves up for success, we get to this point where we've reached yellow, this middle phase begins, and now the clock is turning. We have two things that we can control: time and temperature. Both of these will influence the end result of the coffee, and we talked about that. If we have too short a time or too long of time, if the temperatures are too high or too low, they'll rush us or they'll stall us during this middle phase. So we need to be very careful and be very cognizant of the roast while this phase is going on, paying attention to it, and we need to be aiming for first crack. So the way that I do this is I monitor my rate of rise during my roast. This is really important. I'm monitoring my rate of rise during the roast so that when I get from dry end, whatever my rate of rise is there, to first crack, I have a target rate of rise that I want my roaster and my coffee to be at when I achieve first crack. So I also have a fixed amount of time that I want will allow this coffee to be able to go through this process where all of these chemical reactions are taking place. So if I want this middle phase to last 4 minutes, then I need to make sure that I adjust my heat so it's going to take me 4 minutes to get from dry end to first crack. That's going to create a slope from dry end to first crack, or an angle that you're going to follow. Now, how do you know this if you're trying to do this and you've never done it before? Well, it's going to take some practice, and we'll talk about how to do that in just a minute. So once you understand how your roaster is behaving, how your beans behave to the heat, and how long it will take you to go from dry end to first crack, then it's not super easy after that, but you've got a greater understanding, and the end result where you know your target to be is attainable, because now you know where you want to be. You've got it somewhat figured out. And again, this is going to take a little bit of experimenting with your roasting process. I had somebody tell me just recently, I was roasting my coffee, and I'm wondering how long I need to have it roast between when I put the beans in and when I get to first crack. First crack is an event. It's an event we need to note and be aware of, right? It's a what I'll call a waypoint during roasting, okay? But first crack isn't necessarily a goal or an achievement in a sense. It's just a marker. It's a reference point for us. What's more important is understanding by visually looking at the beans when the colors change and writing that down. It's also important to smell we can all smell when we start to smell things like bread or things like sweetness, right? Those things, we mark those things down. Eyeing the coffee, watching the color as it progresses through the roast, and also smelling it. And then the other thing that you should be doing is you should be writing down the temperatures. So every 30 seconds, write down the temperature that your roaster, your bean temperature. After you write it down, the 30-second increments, you need to measure or basically determine the difference in the temperatures in those 30-second increments. So let's say the temperature rises 10 degrees in 30 seconds. So you've written down the temperatures, and then you figured, okay, it's 10 degrees between this last time and the time before. Well, that tells me that if your rate of rise for 1 minute is 20 degrees a minute for your rate of rise. So that's the whole terminology of the ROR, or roar, what people call the rate of rise. And that is the temperature increase as you go through this roasting process. When you get to dry end and you start to work your way down to first crack, you have a rate of rise at dry end that you would have achieved. Let's just say that that rate of rise is 20. So at dry end, your rate of rise is 20. You want to have your rate of rise at first crack be 12 or 14. So between that time, now you can see how slowly you need to back your heat off so that you're still increasing the temperature of your roast, but you're doing it at a slower rate. You're doing it so that your rate of rise now descends from 20 degrees a minute to 12 or 14 degrees a minute. So you need to lose 8 degrees a minute or 6 degrees a minute from dry end to first crack. And you need to do that within 4 minutes. I'm using this example that I shared before, that if my goal was a 4-minute middle phase between dry end and first crack, and I have a rate of rise of 20 at dry end, and I want it to be at 14 when I am at first crack, then I need, and I've got my slope for my descent, and I need to time that. So I back off my heat, and you're charting these temperatures, and if you find that you drop below and you're starting to go down quicker than you're supposed to, you need to quickly turn your heat up so that you don't crash your roast or stall your roast. If you find that your roast is not slowing down, that you're still at 20 or 19 or 18 and you're approaching first crack, you're going to fly through first crack. You're not going to get the 4-minute mark or whatever time that is you're trying to achieve. It's going to be much less, and so then you have not enough time for these chemical reactions to take place, and you can have some bitterness or some very tart or intense flavors, and they're not necessarily all good. And a lot of that's because the beans probably not even roasted all the way through because you're going so fast. So I hope this has made sense so far. I want to talk more about charting and how to actually do all of this, but I don't want us to get lost in some of the numbers that I shared. These are only examples. What you're going to need to do is to be able to write all this down, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. Before we do, I want to thank you guys for joining me. If you like what you're hearing, if you like what you see, hit the like button now. That tells YouTube that something good is going on here, and then when home coffee roasters like you are searching on YouTube for videos to watch, they'll find my videos. Also, if you like what you see and you want to support me, then subscribe to this channel. That would be great. I'd really appreciate that. And if you want to be notified, hit the bell icon, and when I upload videos, you'll be notified. All right, so thank you so much for doing that. So how do we document all this stuff, or how do we learn all this stuff? Because it seems kind of confusing. I'm sure it's confusing. I've given a lot of information. I probably haven't done it in a really organized fashion, but I want to be sure that at least this point hits home, and that is is that if you're not writing down your temperatures, if you're not writing down your times, if you're not writing down your events, like when you put the beans in the roaster, when you reached dry end, when you reached first crack, when first crack ended, and when you dropped the beans out. All of those things are events. When you need to write all of these things down on on an X and a Y axis. So basically kind of an L sheet. So you've got your temperatures here going up and down, and on the bottom you have your time. And then along the way you're charting your temperatures, and then you'll also be able to chart your rate of rise. So you've seen coffee graphs online. That's basically what you're going to be creating. But what it's going to show you is what's happening to your roast. It's going to show you what's happening during your dry phase, during your browning, your middle phase, the browning phase, and then the development phase. It's going to show you how fast, what your temperatures are doing, what your rate of rise is doing, so you'll know whether you need to be adding more heat or less heat during the roasting process. That's really important, because if you're not doing that, then all you're really doing is turning the heat on, browning your beans, and getting them to first crack and saying you've roasted coffee. If that's working for you, that's great, that's awesome, but ultimately this middle phase is where the sweetness is going to be developed and where the acidity is going to be developed. And if that's what you're trying to achieve, then this is a very important phase for you, and you're probably going to need to start to write these things down or to document them somehow. If you have a roaster, some of these newer roasters, they hook up to Artisan, but you're not quite sure how to operate Artisan. Some of what I shared today should enlighten you a little bit and kind of give you an idea of what's happening with Artisan and some of these lines that are going all over the place. And there's some great videos online that people have done using Artisan, so I would encourage you to check those out as well. So the end result is that we get to first crack, but this whole process, this whole chemical reaction that's taking place does not stop at first crack. Now, I just said that the browning phase, this middle phase, takes place from dry end to first crack, but the truth is that development, or the chemical reactions, continue all the way through to when you drop the coffee, and all the way through until it's cool, and maybe even beyond that. But ultimately, you want to get the coffee cooled as quick as possible. This development phase, this third phase, is a phase that's going to help you kind of balance your cup of coffee and to develop body in your coffee, and also to be able to kind of tweak what you want to do with the sweetness and tweak what you want to do with the fruitiness. There's some coffees that are naturally really sweet, but you might not want all of that sweetness. And so you may intentionally roast your coffee into this development third phase a little bit longer to kind of mute down some of those flavors. Same thing with the acidity. Maybe you don't want the real intense fruit bomb and you want to just tone that down a little bit. Then that's the whole purpose of this third phase, this development phase, is to be able to get a balanced cup. It's to be able to help tone down the coffee a little bit if that's what you want. And in all of this process, it allows your beans to be roasted all the way through. Now, I'm talking to people who roast their coffee from a light to medium roast. If you go dark, then you're basically taking all of the things we talked about in this middle phase, and you're muting them, you're roasting out the sweetness, and you're roasting out the acidity. The longer you go in this development, the more bitter your coffee will get, the less sweet it will get, and the longer you go in this development, the less acidity you'll have. You're just roasting it out. And when you hit second crack in your coffee, if that's how far you're going, you're basically taking all of the characteristics, the unique character of the coffee, and most of that is being burned up. It's being roasted away. And if that's your roasting style and you like that, that is okay. That's great. I'm glad you're roasting coffee, and that's awesome. But for those of you that are really trying to get the flavor notes out of the bag, then I hope that some of the things that I've shared in this video have made sense. And if you've got questions, ask questions in the comments. How are you roasting your coffee? Have you heard of this middle phase, and did you know that these chemical reactions are taking place during this middle phase? And if you did you know how to control them? Did you know that it's about time and temperature, and that we have the ability to shape these flavors? Most of you may have known that, but maybe some of you aren't sure or haven't quite figured out how to do it. I'm still learning along the way. Share your comments. If you've got suggestions or a different way that you're roasting that's giving you great results for maximum flavor in your coffee, for sweetness and or acidity, share those in the comments. This isn't the only way to roast coffee. I haven't figured this out. I'm still learning along the way, but I have roasted some really, really good coffee. I've had some great successes. I've had some failures too. I've made some mistakes. A few weeks ago, I made some mistakes on a roast I was doing on the channel here, and so, you know, I'm a home roaster like you, and things don't always go the way I hope they do. But I hope that this video has helped you. Thank you so much for joining me today, and we will see you next time here at the Virtual Coffee Lab.